All right, so this video is going to go over all of the clay basics. Some of you guys might have done clay projects before, but I'm going to introduce all this information as if you have not made anything ceramic before that's been fired in a kiln. So we're using a brown ceramic clay. When you first get a fresh piece of clay, it has a lot of moisture in the clay, so it's easy to manipulate and to sculpt, and that's called plasticity. The more that you are doing something dynamic with your sculpture, with your additive and subtractive techniques, it's helpful to have really plastic clay, so to have a high water content in it. You can't just take water from the sink and then just put it on the clay and then that fix it. It is adding moisture back, but it's not adding it consistently through the clay. So the best thing for you to do is when you get your fresh clay, keep it stored the correct way for the whole project, and then it's going to be really easy to use. So we asked everybody to bring in 2 sandwich-sized Ziploc bags, and if you brought them, this is going to make your life a lot easier while you're working on this project. We have small trash bags for you to use, but they're not as airtight as Ziploc bags. So if you are able to bring them in while we work on this, that's going to be really helpful for you. So one Ziploc bag is going to be to hold all of the clay that you're not currently using. And when you put your clay in your bag, you'll want to take all the little bits and pieces that you've been using, the little scraps, squish it up into one piece of clay, put it down in the bag, and then squish the bag as much as you can, kind of roll it up and squish out all the extra air, and then zip it shut. Okay, you should have your names on both of your bags with a Sharpie so that we don't get everybody's clay mixed up, because you'll be keeping your stuff in a crate with the rest of your table mates. That way we can keep everything separate when we're not really sure which belongs to which person. So whenever you're working in class actively and you have clay you're not using, keep it in the bag. That's going to keep the water from evaporating out of the clay and keep this from drying up. You get 1 piece of clay for this project. You're not going to get any extra. So if you leave it out exposed to the air while you're working in class and it starts to get sort of crumbly and harder to use, you're going to have to deal with that. You get that 1 piece of clay, all right? So keep anything you're not currently using in the Ziploc bag and take it out as you need it. Your other bag is going to be for, we'll have 2 block periods where we're working on these stamp handles. And so you'll be able to take your project and put it gently in the bag, get out as much air as possible without squishing your project. And then we'll keep our projects in progress in those bags. So you should have 2 Ziploc bags. Okay, to start our piece, you should have already finished your sketchbook planning and have your notes, your reminders on how to attach your clay, sculptural techniques, and your sketch. And I think it's a good idea to have your sketchbook out while you're working, because you should be looking back at your reference pictures and your sketch while you're working. So I'm keeping mine propped up over here off camera. All right, so the first thing you are going to do is roll out the base for your stamp. This is where your rubber block that we're going to carve is going to get attached later on the bottom. And you're going to be using some tools. We'll give you some slabs that are already rolled out to the correct size, but you should have these things out at your table. Some things you'll be using individually and others you'll share with your table mates. So the first one would be a wooden modeling tool. These are dual-ended, so usually you have one side that's rounded and one side that has a point, but there's different shapes to them, and they're just going to help add textures, to smooth out clay, to cut the clay up into pieces, and to blend the pieces together when you make attachments. You'll have a paper clip that we'll use as a scoring tool to create textures to attach the clay pieces. You'll have a Sgraffito tool, and this is good for sculpting. It has, it's dual-ended again. You have the little wire bits on either side, and this is really great for subtractive techniques and to create textures. And then you should have your ruler, because we need to be measuring our sizes of the stamp, how tall it is, how wide it is, and all of that. So rule for the clay, okay? And you should have already considered this when you made your design. This one's not done. It's in progress. Anything that is thicker, just as a reminder, thicker than the base of your thumb should be hollow. And you could hollow it out like this is just barely okay, the bottom of this tree branch here. If that was any thicker than that, I have some choices to make. I could take this piece, okay, that's in progress right here. I could take this, and this is going to be the front. I'm going to add moth wings here, moss, little stones, and some ladybugs crawling up the branch. This technically is the back. Okay, I'm not going to put as much stuff here. So I could take my Sgraffito tool and I could hollow out some of the clay from the back if I wanted to. All right, that's going to make this dry more evenly. And it's also, the thicker the piece of clay is, there could be moisture trapped in the middle that we don't know about. And it feels dry on the outside, but there's a little bit of moisture still on the inside of your sculpture. And moisture, when it's heated up, turns into steam. So if we put this project, once it dried for a couple days, in the kiln, and that water on the inside that we don't know about because we can't feel it, turns into steam, it's going to create a path out of the clay. There's not one, so it's going to make one. And moisture is always the reason why things explode in the kiln. Always. Okay. So I could hollow it from the back, or I could take a tool, my paper clip or a different tool, and I could cut a hole through the base on the bottom here. I could cut a hole up into the branch so it's hidden here on the bottom. Eventually that's going to get covered up with the stamp anyways. So I could hollow out a hole through the core of it from the bottom. All right. But mine's just barely okay. So I'm going to leave it like it is. So the first thing we're doing is we're making the base to build up from, okay? And as we talked about before, that's going to measure the same thing as your stamp block. That's 2 inches by 2.5 inches. We are going to provide you guys with some little templates, or you can just measure with your ruler. Miss Holland's class is going to be starting off with the stamp first and then doing the clay. And my classes, Miss Hinkey's classes, are going to be starting off with the clay and then doing the printmaking, the stamp. So your class may or may not already have these. So you can just measure it. It's 2 inches tall, 2.5 inches wide. Okay. So now we have a little slab that is 1/4 inch thick and then measures 2 by 2.5. And we're just going to do some fine tuning to this. Okay. So with clay, any sharp edges, any tight edges like this, once it's dried and it's fired, those will actually be sharp edges. Okay, if you were to add glaze on top of a sharp edge piece of clay that's been fired, it would be sharp and could cut you. So we are going to round off the edges on both sides. So I just flipped it over. I'm doing that on the bottom as well. And then I'm going to take this. I don't want to have corners anyway at all, so I'm going to round mine off. I'm just taking my slab and rolling it on the table. Okay, it's kind of hard to see from that angle. I'm rolling it like this on the table. Just a little bit. You don't want to totally smush it. Just want it to still be a rectangle, but with rounded corners. And then sometimes your favorite tool to use is really just using your hands and your fingers to sculpt with. So you can decide if you like using the modeling tool better or just want to use your fingers to shape things and to sculpt. But you're going to do both sides. Okay, so now this is the base for our stamp. That's what your rubber will get attached to. And then that's what you're going to build up from. You can see on this one that's in progress, it's right here. Okay, as we work on these projects, they are going to shrink just a little bit as the water evaporates out of the clay. And they'll shrink a little bit more when they're fired in the kiln. So they'll be a little bit smaller than they are now. And that's why we told you guys when you're carving and drawing your image on the stamp, stay about 1/4 inch away from the edges. That way, once this shrinks, we can cut this to trim it to fit it custom. All right, so that's my base for my piece. If that's as far as you got on the first day after passing everything out and getting out your stuff and whatnot, then that would be the only thing that you bagged up in your bag. But if you're ready to keep moving on, you can put this in your bag so it's not drying out too fast, and then start working on details. So on my sketch, I did, I'm going to have this tree branch here with some moss and little ladybugs, some flowers and stones, and I'm going to have a moth because that's the theme for my stamp. So I've started working on this. I've got my tree branch that I made, and I just kind of squished the clay into that shape, a big coil, and rolled it on this tar paper. This is the surface we're going to work on to keep all the clay on the tar paper so we don't make huge mess on the tables. The clay also doesn't really stick to the tar paper at all, but it will stick like crazy to the metal tables. So we're going to keep the mess here. And then I've got some details that I've started attaching. So a little breaking, the branch breaking off to another branch, and then the body of what's going to be a moth. So I want to show you a few things. Depending on what you're making, some details might be easier, like my moth, the wings are going to be really thin. They're not as thin as like real life a moth, because that would be way too delicate. But I started off by taking a piece of clay and just kind of smushing it to make a slab. It's about a 1/4 inch thick. And then I used my paper clip to draw the shape of my moth wings on it, and I cut them out like this, just using the paper clip. Okay, so I had 2 sets of wings. All right, this is what I had first. And if you stop here, you're missing the buck on making a sculpture, because it's all about the fine details, the textures, and the additive and subtractive sculpture for this to look good. Okay, this is like sugar cookie cutout, and it doesn't look realistic. I mean, it's the shape of a wing, but there's not a lot of detail to it. So I literally just took my paper clip, cut the wings so that I have the top wing and the bottom wing like that. And then you just take them and you do some sculpting techniques on it. So now this is the top and bottom wing that I'm going to end up attaching. And the way that I made these details is just by taking my wing. This will be my right wing. Okay. So I took my wing, I went around the edges just like we did with the base piece and rounded off that top corner, because that's what makes it look like flat cookie cutter kind of shape. So I'm rounding it off. It'll make it look a little thinner and a little bit more like a real wing. Okay, so it's a little more sculptural like that. Smooth away any little imperfections. Then you can use the Sgraffito tool. That's what I used to create the designs on the wings. And I just looked at my reference picture to decide where am I going to put different colors on here. And then I can dig out those negative spaces with my Sgraffito tool. And I have these little, they had these little roughly sort of linear patterns on the edges of the wings. So I just took my Sgraffito tool and instead of digging, I pressed it into the wing to create this texture along the edges and on the interior of the wing like this. And I did that on the top and on the bottom. And then to make this look a little more 3D and less just like flat cookie cutter, when I attach them, I'm going to attach them like the wings are in motion like this. Okay, and they will get attached to the moth body on here so that it's 3-dimensional. All right. So one of the other things we need to talk about is how do I attach things in a way where they're hopefully going to stay attached and not come off. All right. So here's my stamp that I've got in progress here. Let's see if I can move you a little closer. So you are going to be creating a texture. Think of it almost like you're creating like Velcro almost. If I want this bottom wing to attach right here and the top wing to attach about right there, then this one's on the bottom, so I would attach it first. Okay. The surface area, the amount of surface area that's going to touch, if you have more surface area, it's going to have a stronger attachment. If you have less, it's going to be more delicate. So you need to keep that in mind. You want to make it as realistic as you can, but that's something to keep in mind. So this is going to stick on here. The clay is wet right now, so if I just smush it on, it's going to stick right now. But as soon as that evaporates away and the water's gone, if someone even touches this or even kind of looks at it the wrong way, it's going to break off. So we will know when we're picking these things up and handling them all to put them in the kiln if you follow directions or not. So I use my paper clip to make some little cross-hatching marks there, and we're using these little cups. They have vinegar and water in them, and vinegar acts as an acid and it breaks down the clay a little bit to make slip. You can start to see that there's liquefied clay there, and that is called slip. So I'm taking this piece, I'm putting it over on this one, and I'm gently pressing them together. And I'm going to use my paintbrush to kind of clean away the slip mess. And then I'm just using my finger. You could also use your modeling tool if you wanted. And you're taking a little bit of clay from one of the pieces and you're smoothing it over to the other. If you still want them to look separate, like I want the wing to look like it's not part of the body, but it's coming from it, you can go back and add lines and stuff later. But you want to have a nice blend on it. And then I would flip this over and I'd do the same thing back here. I could even add like a little piece of clay, since this is pretty delicate. It's a thin attachment area. I could add a little wedge of clay, score marks vinegar, and put it right here, and then blend it to the tree and to the butterfly wing to make this stronger. And I will do that later. Okay. So then I would do the same thing here. I might chop off a little bit of that wing, but then attach this guy so it layers over the bottom wing a little bit to make that a little more realistic here when I attach it. Okay. So another thing, attachments are really, really important. If you do them wrong, your project is going to fall apart. Okay. But another thing that you need to be doing, one of your requirements is to add textures to your project. You might add some texture, like these are some little leaves that I made that I'm going to, if I can sharpen this, that I'm going to add to my sculpture. And so I made these little leaf shapes, and you can use your modeling tool or your paper clip to go in, and these have little veining lines on them. I've got some little flowers that those have a little bit of texture on them on the little inside part. Those have texture. And then I'm going to have some little bugs on the branch that have little textured details on the wings on their shells as well. We do have some stamps. This is a stamp sheet for clay, and I'll have a box of those out for either class that you guys can use. Just don't keep any clay like stuck into these. You're welcome to use them for the project though. And then you can create all of your own textures. This is a little kitchen strainer that I keep to make moss. So you can take your clay and push it through the strainer right here. And when you push it through with your finger, it makes this little like kind of fringy texture, and that's perfect for moss. I also used it for the fuzz on the moth. So once you push the clay through, you can just take your paper clip and cut through the bottom. And then I would need to do score marks on the branch where I want to add it and some vinegar water. But then I could attach that on and put some moss growing up the branch down here on the bottom. But there's all different kinds of things that you can do to manipulate, create your own textures and add them to this. You should have more than one really, but at least one good texture on your ceramic piece to meet your requirements. And then you need to be showing additive and subtractive methods on your clay stamp as well.